think we're good to go with the restriction order.
2 minutes.
Good morning. This is an open hearing of the independent inquiry into matters relating to Afghanistan. Please ensure that all mobile phones and other personal electronic devices are either switched off or in silent mode. Please may I also draw to your attention to the fact that the chair of the inquiry, Lord Justice Haddon-Cave, has made a restriction order dated the 5th of September 2024 in relation to the conduct of those who are attending the hearing. The full order is displayed on the inquiry website and on the door of this court and of the media annex, but I will summarise its purpose. The first part of the order, which applies to this and to all future hearings of the inquiry, prohibits any person from making an audio or video recording of inquiry proceedings from within the hearing rooms without the express permission of the chair. Furthermore, no person may take a photograph in any room in which the inquiry proceedings are taking place and at a time the inquiry is sitting without the express permission of the chair. For the avoidance of doubt, both of these prohibitions extend to the hearing in the media annex. The second part of the order, which applies to the hearing scheduled to take place today and tomorrow, if the evidence is not concluded today, arises as the live stream of these inquiry proceedings via YouTube will purposely be subject to a 10-minute delay. Where those who have supplied evidence to the inquiry have applied to restrict information from publication outside of the inquiry, in some instances, the chair has made the restriction orders, the effect of which is to protect that information. A restriction order prohibits the use, publication, or dissemination of the information that it covers. In the event that something is said during the course of this hearing which may breach a restriction order made by the chair, the evidence may be halted and the hearing room and annex may be cleared for closed legal submissions as to whether any restriction order has been breached, and the live stream YouTube recording will be temporarily stopped for this period. Counsel to the inquiry, or the solicitor to the inquiry, must be informed of any request to make an application for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in the preceding 10 minutes. If an application is made for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in the preceding 10 minutes, anything that was said or done during that period is subject to a restriction order prohibiting its disclosure, repetition or duplication until the chair has finally determined the application. Every restriction order is subject to a penal notice. This means that any breach of any element of the restriction orders may be certified to the High Court or the Court of Session, who will have the power to fine or imprison anyone found to have been in breach of the order. Court rise.
Good morning. Before calling today's witness, who will be Sir Ben Wallace, I'd like to give a brief update about the work of the inquiry since the last public hearing on the 3rd of May. I do so because, for reasons that I hope are well understood, much of the work of the inquiry and its hearings has, by necessity, to take place in closed, for reasons set out in my original rulings on restriction orders, including reasons of national security, and the fact that it is only possible for the inquiry to hold open hearings on a limited number of occasions, like today, does not mean that a great deal of important work has and is going on, and witnesses' evidence is being heard in the meantime. To recap, in the first quarter or so of this year, the inquiry heard the first part of the complaints and concerns evidence, namely evidence from military witnesses who raised and shared concerns at the time as to the activities of UKSF-1 when conducting deliberate detention operations in Helmand during the period mid-2010 to mid-2013. The inquiry completed the first two phases of the DDO investigation strategy, namely the inquiry's investigation approach into the contemporaneous documentation and operational staff work generated during the planning and conduct of DDOs, details of which are set out on the inquiry website. The result of these intensive tranches of work by the inquiry team in respect of DDO phases 1 and 2 is that the inquiry is now in a position to identify from the hundreds of DDOs which took place between mid-2010 and mid-2013, in respect of which there are important unanswered questions and/or unexplained events. There remains phase 3 of the DDO investigation strategy. This has so far involved selecting a further sample of DDOs and seeking disclosure of all relevant material held by the MOD in respect of them, and will in due course involve witness statements being obtained from particular service personnel and subsequent evidential hearings held involving those witnesses. I called a public hearing on the 3rd of May this year because of regrettable delays by the Ministry of Defence meeting deadlines for disclosure and responding to the inquiry's Rule 9 requests. And most significantly, it transpired that disclosure in respect of DDO Phase 3 was going to be delayed by 6 months. It was fairly accepted by Mr. O'Connor KC at that hearing, who unreservedly apologised on behalf of the MOD that the MOD had failed to appreciate the scale of the disclosure task and had failed adequately to resource their disclosure team, and he informed me that immediate steps were being taken at a high level to remedy the situation. I understand that a number of steps have since been taken by the MOD to increase resourcing, in particular recruitment of suitable personnel and the obtaining of disclosure software. And Phase 3 material is now coming through. This is welcome, and the inquiry team are keeping the situation under review. The inquiry team has remained agile and pressed on, and I'm pleased to report that whilst DDO Phase 3 has had to be put back, there has been considerable progress in the last 4 months in other important areas. Principally, the inquiry heard the second part of complaints and concerns and received evidence from further UKSF and associated witnesses about the contemporaneous concerns raised, that UKSF-1 were engaged in a campaign of executing Afghan males in Helmand during these operations, during the period in question, which was being deliberately covered up. It's anticipated that detailed gists of the evidence of complaints and concerns, witnesses, will be posted on the inquiry website this autumn. Consideration is also being given to the gisting of DDO Phase 1 and DDO Phase 2 evidence, insofar as this is possible, consistent with national security and my restriction orders. Second, preparations are well in hand for the next tranche of hearings to take place this autumn, when the inquiry will hear from witnesses who've made direct contact with the inquiry team, many of whom who have used the confidential and secure methods set out on the inquiry website. This evidence is relevant to a number of aspects of the inquiry's terms of reference, including the allegations that UKSF were engaged in a campaign of extrajudicial killings. The individuals who have approached the inquiry directly have done so with my assurance that the inquiry will take all appropriate measures to ensure confidentiality and to protect identities. For obvious reasons, it is likely that most, if not all, these hearings will need to take place in closed. The inquiry has indicated in a CTI note prepared and published on the inquiry website that in the case of some IIA confidential witnesses, it may be necessary to hold what are called restricted closed hearings, namely closed hearings where the only people present will be myself and a limited number of appropriately cleared members of the inquiry team and no one else. We've received submissions on this proposal from all core participants. I've considered these submissions and am satisfied that restricted closed hearings are an option that I may direct, subject to the inquiry providing information and gists about such hearings where possible and appropriate. However, to the fullest extent possible, these IIA witness statements and oral evidence will be gisted in the normal way and made available to core participants and published on the inquiry website. The model to which the inquiry is working, which has enabled the considerable progress to date, is to progress the work streams and hearings in relation to all three main questions under the terms of reference at the same time. Namely, 1, is there credible information as to extrajudicial killings? 2, were they covered up? 3, was the Royal Military Police inquiry fit for purpose? With this in mind, thirdly, work has been going on simultaneously in relation to the preparation of an expert's report regarding the Royal Military Police and Operation Northmoor. Notification as to the date of publication of this expert's report will be made in due course. Fourthly, by way of update, the inquiry is also in the process of instructing forensic experts to assist with the analysis of selected deliberate detention operations. Currently, experts from 3 disciplines will be instructed. A bloodstain pattern analysis expert to consider the blood stain patterns in the evidence published. A ballistics expert to consider evidence relating to the use of firearms. And a pathologist to consider the injuries on the deceased as depicted in the evidence. The inquiry will continue to keep all core participants appraised of the developments relating to these work streams and will provide a further update in due course. Finally, I'm very grateful for the early expression of support from the new Secretary of State, the Right Hon. John Healey, MP, who in his all-staff letter of the 31st of July said, quote, "My ministers and I reiterate our strong support for the inquiry and urge full cooperation from all defence personnel and veterans who possess information relevant to the inquiry terms of reference to come forward and support the inquiry. This can be facilitated by the MOD or by contacting the inquiry directly and confidentially. We recognise that the inquiry may be stressful, bringing up complex and mixed feeling for you and your families. Accordingly, we will do all we can to support those impacted, including through the provision of full legal and pastoral support, with full confidentiality for as long as they need. I repeat again the importance of proactive cooperation by everyone, without me having to resort to my statutory powers, in order that this inquiry can report within a reasonable timescale, in accordance with the terms of reference. I remind those who have not already done so that you can get in touch with the inquiry directly and confidentially using one of the secure methods explained on the inquiry website. I intend to give an update on the future timetable and timescale of the inquiry early in the new year, after I have assessed progress and delivery in this next important quarter. Thank you. I'll rise for Sir Ben Wallace to be brought in and assume the witness stand.
Stay straight in there, it's fine. But he doesn't take the oath till the judge comes in.
Sir Ben, thank you for coming to give evidence to the inquiry today. We've got plenty of time, as you know, so do take as much time as you wish. And we'll be taking regular breaks during the day. Can Sir Ben be sworn, please?
Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Glasgow.
Please, sir. Could you please give the court your full name?
Robert Ben Lobban Wallace.
And then you have in front of you a number of different files, and can I check that we have the same material? First, you have the black file that you've opened, and in that will be your witness statement to the inquiry, together with the exhibits attached to it. And in case it makes it easier for you, what we've done is we've put a treasury tag through your witness statement in case you want to remove it from that file to give access to both the witness statement and the exhibits.
Yes, I've got that. Thank you.
You have on your far right a red file which identifies the gisting for certain individuals and bodies, and when we come to refer to anything that shouldn't be referred to in open, I'll invite you to look at that if necessary. But if at any stage a mistake is made by you, please do not worry about it. We've got the opportunity to correct anything because there is a delay on the live feed.
Yes, thank you very much.
And then to your right, you've brought in with you your own copy of the same documents that we have in the black file. Is that correct?
Yes, there's nothing additional. It's just if I have to refer to something, I know where they are. It's the same thing.
In the event that you need to swap between one or other folder, please do so. Let us know. And if at any stage you find yourself confused as to where we are or what document we are looking at, will you let me know, because that will be my fault and not yours.
Yes, thank you.
Now, just dealing first of all with your exhibits and your statement. The statement is dated the 8th of February of this year, and attached to it were some 15 exhibits. And would you like that statement to stand as your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, please.
Now, what I'd like to do, please, and I hope to help you by setting out a little of the areas I'd like to touch upon. We're going, I hope, to deal with your evidence in a chronological order. It may involve moving around in your statement a little bit because you very kindly answered our specific questions in the order in which they were asked, but on occasions I'd like to just try to deal with it chronologically to help you. And again, we may deal with some of the exhibits not in the order in which they've been provided by you. That's no fault of yours, but again, I'd like to help you with putting them in order. To start with, please, Sir Ben, what I'd like to do is to have a little help from you about first your military career, and second, your political career. And I don't need all of the details of either, but to help everyone understand the relevant experience that you had that has eventually led you to appear before this inquiry. If we deal very briefly with your military career, and if I step over anything that I shouldn't have done and you need to correct me, please tell me. But you set that out very helpfully on the second page of your witness statement in our paragraph number 5. And you'd identified that you had attended the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst and had been commissioned as an officer in the Scots Guards in 1991.
Yes.
And you'd set out that you had served in Northern Ireland, in Germany, in Cyprus, and in Central America, and that your period of active service ended in 1998 when you transferred to the reserves.
Yes.
And although obvious given the countries that I've just identified, for the purposes of clarity only, at any stage did you serve in Afghanistan?
No.
As to your political career, if you turn back, please, Sir Ben, to page 1 and to your paragraph 4, first of all. You were, at the time of writing the witness statement in February of this year, still a serving Member of Parliament. And you'd set out that you had been first elected in 2005. In terms of posts that you had held, you had been the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the then Secretary of State for Justice, Ken Clarke, between 2010 and 2014. You had then, following the 2015 general election, been appointed the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Northern Ireland office. And then between July 2016 and July 2019, Minister of State for Security at the Home Office. But can we just deal with the last of your cabinet appointments, which is the most relevant for the purposes of your evidence today? Between the 24th of July of 2019 and the 31st of August of 2023, were you appointed Secretary of State for Defence?
Yes.
As to that, please, and again hoping to deal with this by way of summary rather in total detail, could I just invite you, if you wouldn't mind, to look, please, to our page 3 and to paragraph 9, because you provided there a little more detail about the Secretary of State for Defence and, in particular, your role.
Yeah.
You'd identified that in your role as Secretary of State for Defence, you had overall responsibility for the business of the MOD, which at that stage employed over 220,000 military and civilian personnel and had a budget of almost £53 billion.
Yes.
Your responsibilities included the strategic operations and operational strategy of the MOD. It also included defence planning, programme and resource allocation, and heading up the UK's strategic international partnerships and the UK's nuclear operations. And did you also at that time have responsibilities which straddled both the policy and the operational functions of the MOD?
Yes.
And were you supported in your role by 4 ministers, namely the Minister for the Armed Forces, the Minister for Defence Procurement, the Minister for Defence People and Veterans, now known as the Minister for Defence People and Families, and lastly the Minister for Defence in the House of Lords?
Yes.
Before we embark on any more detail of your evidence, you were served with a request for evidence under the rule line of the inquiry rules in December of 2023. And in that document, the inquiry had asked you a number of specific questions which you have very kindly answered. What I'm going to do, sir, is to take you through those questions and your answers and to try to focus your evidence on the particular matters that we invited your attention to in December of last year. Can I check that in addition to the exhibits that you have provided to us, have you had an opportunity to review the witness statement of Johnny Mercer?
Yes.
As well as a transcript of the evidence that he gave to this inquiry?
I watched his transcript. I watched his evidence on the streaming service.
Thank you very much indeed. Now again, we will come to deal with some of what he had to say in his witness statement as well as some of what he said to the inquiry. And if at any stage I don't ask you something that you think is important, will you stop me and ask me to make up anything clear to you or to give you the opportunity to make something clear to the inquiry?
Yes, if I could just make the point, you said earlier that the importance of being Defence Secretary at the heart of what this is questioned. There are 2 notes. I was also the Northern Ireland Minister, which is where I first came across the extensive levels of inquiries into state killings as alleged and described in Northern Ireland, and that was my first experience of the legal challenges around both investigating the past and indeed trying to resolve some of those issues. And secondly, my bio misses out. I was also a government whip, I think from 2014 to 2016.
Thank you very much indeed. Since you've touched upon the questions of investigations into allegations of killings, can we turn then straight away with your help in your witness statement to paragraph 10? So if you can I take you back, please? It will be to the bottom of page 3 and overleaf to the top of page 4. You were asked there about handover communications that you had received and steps that you took upon assuming office that might be relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference. Can I ask you this, focusing, if I can please, on the question of Operation Northmoor? We know, of course, that you've told us that you became Secretary of State for Defence in late July 2019. And at that stage, Operation Northmoor was already a well-established investigation. When you took over as Secretary of State for Defence, were you provided with any handover or information that related specifically to the RMP inquiry, Operation Northmoor?
Well, first of all, as relation to your question and the original statement, there was no verbal handover at all from my predecessors. Sadly, that is a characteristic of most governments, that it's in and out very quickly. Secondly, I wasn't given a detailed handover at all of Northmoor insofar as it came to my attention, as I said in the statement, really at first, when I was first given the submission requesting that I grant or write to the Defence Committee to tell them that we were closing down, I think was the correct phrase, that they wanted to do the investigation. And that is when I started to seek more information. Obviously, having come from being Security Minister, I've been focused on all the other areas right up until the day I walked into the new office. So it is, I was focused on threats at home rather than threats abroad.
And it may be at this remove difficult to say to what extent you had any prior knowledge of Operation Northmoor before you became Secretary of State for Defence. But can you think now whether it's something that you were aware of?
If I was aware of it, it was only something that was sort of chattering in the background of the media. I mean, I had not been exposed to it in a sense as security minister in any form or manner. And if I did, I would have to go back and check the record. But ultimately, as this was a Royal Military Police lead, it is highly unlikely it would have come across my desk as security minister at the time in the Home Office.
In which case, can with your help we turn please in the black file to look behind divider 1. That is your first exhibit, Sir Ben, and that is the document you just referred to a moment ago.
Yes.
And we have available here what is described as an Afghan Legacy Investigations update. It's dated as we look at the document. If I pause for a moment so that the document can be brought up on the screen. Thank you very much indeed. We can see that the document itself bears a date in the top left corner of the 5th of August 2019. So only a matter of days or so after you had been appointed Secretary of State for Defence. If we look across to the right-hand side, we can see there is a box which is provided by a receipt stamp for the Ministerial Support Unit, and it appears from that this document has been stamped with a date of sometime in September 2019. It's difficult to make out on the copy that we've got. It may be that it's possibly the 9th of September, but can you see just beneath the name for Ben Sanders, we can see what appears to be SEP for September and then 2019.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of this document, which is obviously one that you are familiar with, Sir Ben, can I just ask you this before we look at any of its particular detail? Again, I appreciate it's a very difficult question, and if you can't answer it, of course you should say. But can you remember now how early in September you had sight of a document that it was in fact dated the 5th of August?
I can't exactly remember. I would suggest that my special advisor's notes would probably tell if he was in the room, and I would recommend the inquiry access those detailed notes if they haven't as yet. I mean, for what it is worth, whether it is the first week of September or the second week of September versus the 5th of August, I'm not entirely sure that it makes a difference to my subsequent actions as a result of it.
And this note, as we look at it, we can see it provides initially recommendations for you, and then also on our first page it provides some background and then various other details over leaf. Again, doing your best to cast your mind back, Sir Ben, to the first time you looked at this, was this the first opportunity that you had to consider the extent of the allegations at that stage being investigated by the Royal Military Police?
Sorry, just say that again?
Was this the first opportunity that you had to consider the extent of the allegations being investigated by the Royal Military Police?
Yes. I mean, I have long enough experience as a minister to, A, be wary of a submission that arrives not long after appointment into the job, but also to not take submissions at face value, especially when it is asking you to do something that felt not normal. We don't close investigations in this country. We run out of lines of inquiry. And I remember the language used was in itself sort of raised a flag. And so then I set about asking more questions to get to the bottom of this before I was going to commit myself to any letter or otherwise. Just out of note, the handwriting on the top of the page is not my handwriting. I presume it is from one of my private secretaries as notes of it. But that was the first time that I said, okay, look, before I myself take responsibility and send a letter to a defence committee, I would like to know more about it.
Before we consider your actions upon receiving this document for the first time, can we just look at the recommendations it made and invited you to consider? We see those set out in paragraph 3, and it invites you to take note of a number of matters. That the RMP had established Operation Northmoor in March 2014 to provide coherence to investigations of allegations connected with detention in Afghanistan. Operation Northmoor has examined 675 allegations by 159 complainants. These ranged in seriousness from alleged instances of non-criminal cultural insensitivity to allegations of assault and of unlawful killing during arrest operations. If I pause for a moment, if you weren't already aware of the extent, both in terms of number, but also in terms of seriousness of the allegations being looked at by Operation Northmoor, would it be fair to observe that these first 2 paragraphs under the recommendations would have made it very clear to you the serious allegations being looked at by the Royal Military Police?
Yes, but all these allegations are serious, whether it is IHAT in Iraq, whether it is Northmoor, or indeed whether it is the other investigations or inquiries that were going on. Any allegation of a member of the state using lethal force out with international law or the law is very serious. So it's not specifically because of the submission, it's fundamentally to the tenets of what we stand for.
Thank you. We see that what is then set out in subparagraph 3, on the 15th of July, the Provost Marshal declared the investigation phase of Operation Northmoor complete. No one has been charged or prosecuted for any offence, as the statutory threshold for referring cases to the Director of Service Prosecutions was not met in any case. So, as was clear from that recommendation, the assessment that had been made by the Provost Marshal Army was that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges of any criminal wrongdoing against anyone who'd been investigated.
Well, I think what I would have taken all these things is nothing is complete. All the way through this, my view has been, that it's always based on the evidence you have before you, and if any new evidence appears, it is perfectly possible that a prosecution of any type could be could happen. So I think a better writing the submission, or that I wrote it, would have said something like complete with the available evidence before them. But fundamentally, I have never changed from the position that evidence could become available that would allow a prosecution or might reach the threshold for a prosecution. It was never. So and as you know, the paragraph 3 actually calls it itself a recommendation, but points 1 to 5 are points, and there was only one recommendation in it, which is at point 4, which is to agree to write to the Defence Committee, which I didn't.
Thank you. Can we then look very briefly at 4 before we turn to point 5, and then I'll ask you about what it was that you were being recommended to do, Sir Ben. Point 4 identifies the investigative and litigation consequences of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, raised challenging presentational issues. We had intended to take a low-key and primarily reactive approach to Operation Northmoor with a view to a wider-ranging announcement in the autumn. Insofar as there are investigative and litigation consequences which raise challenging presentational issues, did you understand what that meant?
I think you could take it lots of different ways. I mean, one of the natures of these type of investigations, inquiries, is they are accompanied by a journalistic narrative quite a lot, and therefore that generates either pressure, prejudices, or whatever, depending on the accuracy of those reports. And therefore, I think it is very important that we stuck to a very clear line of following the rule of law and the process that takes us to making certain decisions. It has been the nature, even way before my time as well, that operating in this area is very hard. It is often characterised by media reports, some accurate, some inaccurate, before the judicial process. And you will know, I've forwarded it to the inquiry today, the letter from the Panorama that arrived with a sort of 24 hours notice, making fairly wide allegations to me about me, I felt that would undermine this inquiry to answer their questions before, Sir, you had the opportunity to question me on it. And I think that's part of the problem we face. I understand why. In our open democracy, we have to do this. It's very important charges. They're very serious charges. But ultimately, I think that's what this means when it comes to presentation.
Thank you. Can we then look, please, to the last of the recommendations, or at least the last of the paragraphs within the recommendation section, which contains the recommendation? BBC's Panorama are finalising a programme which we expect to be highly critical on the historical criminal investigations from Afghanistan and Iraq. Although the timing is unclear, this could potentially air as soon as mid-August. It would be advantageous for the Ministry of Defence to announce the closure of Operation Northmoor in advance. Now, in terms of the proposal that you were being invited to adopt there, Sir Pen, what was being set out, it would appear, is a warning to you that there is about to be a television programme by Panorama which will make highly critical observations of the investigations into both Afghanistan and Iraq. And you were being invited, because it was, it said, highly advantageous to do this, to announce the closure of Operation Northmoor before the programme could be aired. And is that a correct understanding of what that recommendation meant?
That is the recommendation. It's not the recommendation I took. It is also wrong in its assertion about advantageous. It is also equally disadvantageous should I announce the closure of it and Panorama or the Sunday Times produce new evidence. I was always conscious that in all of this, despite what you may think about politicians' relationship with the media, you should always, as a minister, be open to suggestions and criticisms and points from the media, from colleagues in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and indeed suggestions by courts in court cases ongoing. It is a foolish minister that shuts their mind to any of it. So I would have probably, as I did with quite a few of my submissions, disagreed with some of these things, and as you know, I didn't progress with that recommendation.
In any way, could you see that there was an advantage for the MOD to announce the closure of Operation Northmoor in advance of the Panorama programme?
No advantage whatsoever.
You were given, in addition to the recommendation, a proposed draft that you send to the Defence Committee as to the closure of Operation Northmoor. And given what you've just said and what you had already told us, at any stage did you adopt that proposal and send such a letter to the Defence Committee?
I'm not sure if I ever did send it. I certainly didn't send it in its early form and in at this stage. I remember it being raised subsequently, and I think in a verbal by officials, but I was much more focused on trying to get to the bottom of where we were with it, and being able to make it very clear that the MOD was always open to, well, it wasn't for me to say, but investigators should always be open to new evidence, wherever that comes from and should it come to light.
When you'd had an opportunity to consider what you had been invited to take note of, and then the recommendation that you had declined in your own mind, at least at that stage, to follow, can I ask you this? What inquiries, if any, did either you make or did you ask others to make about Operation Northmoor?
Well, I think, as you'll see from the statement, this became a more ongoing issue about getting to the bottom of Northmoor, but also the wider other parallel judicial review that was in process at the time, and making sure that we could be really sure of where we stood as the political part of the department, as in within the boundaries. But also, I think it will say here, I wanted to get to the bottom of, if you go further into the document where it sort of expanded some of the issues, to get to the bottom of them. And from there, that is where I started to go down the line of asking and speaking to the Chief Constable of Merseyside, former Chief Constable Sir John Murphy, and indeed to interrogate a number of those reports. So if you look at paragraph 6 of that submission, that's where it first brought to my attention former Chief Constable of Merseyside's review, and indeed His Honour Justice Lyon's review. And I think it was those documents that I think were important to look at, and indeed then meet, as I subsequently did, the Chief Constable, former Chief Constable of Merseyside, to ask his view as a professional police officer, what he thought of the police investigation.
And so, Ben, we will come to all of
Yep.
that in due time, I can assure you, sir. Just dealing with this document for the moment, and recognising that we are still in the autumn of 2019, can we just turn together over to the second page? It's our page 3, and to information that's set out there. We see a section headed Consideration with a number of subparagraphs beneath it. And do you have that, Sir Ben?
Yes.
We see there that set out at the very start of the consideration section reads as follows: the decision to discontinue investigations will not be universally welcomed. Was that a concern that you shared at the time of reading this particular note?
I wasn't concerned about image or public opinion in this, ever. I was concerned about getting to the bottom of it. Because ultimately, I believe in getting to ensure that the investigation was of a quality, and if it wasn't, why not, and what could we do to make sure it doesn't happen again. I was absolutely aware that on both sides of this discussion, there are men and women of our armed forces, 457 of which gave their lives in Afghanistan, who also feel the consequences of the public reporting one way or the other. And I was very aware that none of this, A, makes Britain look good in international circles, but also doesn't help morale in our armed forces. So I didn't think about the actions based on what it would look like. I thought about the actions, and this does go back to my experience in Northern Ireland, in the legacy reviews, about how can we make sure this is either dealt with and come to a conclusion, or it is avoided in the future because we improve our processes. That's ultimately the best way to protect the men and women of the armed forces and indeed Britain's reputation. So I whenever, no offence to our civil service, when they start suggesting political images and political perceptions, it's really a matter that I was not that engaged with. It didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was getting to the bottom of it.
And to your mind, how did you think at this stage that it could be best dealt with as you've just described it? What did you think needed to happen in order that these allegations could be dealt with?
Well, I think, first and foremost, bearing in mind that the military police are independent, and quite rightly so, of ministers and indeed the Service Prosecution Authority, just like CPS and our police are separate from ministers. So bearing that factor in mind, however, I thought it was important to test where we were with both the quality and the veracity of the investigation. Was it vulnerable, for example, to further judicial challenge if I had just proceeded on the statement of the investigation is closed? And my experience would show that over the years, very often, those initial assurances you get turn out not to be true. As we will probably get to later, documents that we've been told we hadn't seen were then later discovered and, under the spirit of candour, quite rightly given up to this inquiry and indeed judicial reviews previously. So ultimately, what all of this did was say to me, look, I need to satisfy myself, because it is my reputation and the department's reputation that we were happy to proceed with whatever direction we went. And that included the quality of the prosecution, hence Sir John Murphy and Justice Lyons, as you'll see later, some of the follow-ups about some of the concerns raised by Johnny Mercer, and not taking at face value previous assurances, but being very, very careful. I didn't wander across the line into interfering with a police investigation. Indeed, at first I was very, very cautious never to meet senior members of the military police, because the last allegations I wanted was we'd had a meeting and then the next thing you know, everything changed. And that is not right, and I don't want to give people the opportunity to say that. So the first thing, I stepped in a deliberate way to get to the bottom of it. And secondly, in a department of 220,000, where unlike the Home Office, which is full of arm's length bodies or operationally independent bodies, so ministers can't interfere with MI5's decision, it's entirely operationally independent, or the 43 police forces we have, the Ministry of Defence, nearly everything goes through the chair of the Secretary of State. It's a very, very, that is your constitutional protection from me, the other way around, from troops, that you are effectively part of that chain of command to enable, to make sure you use political control over the military. So I was very, very determined to test it, but also to therefore make sure that Johnny Mercer's concerns, which we will get to, I'm sure, were also listened to, and he was given the carte blanche and the authority to go and get to the bottom of some of these questions, not just contained in this submission, but subsequent submissions and indeed his own experiences.
And just before we embark on any subsequent meetings or discussions you may have had with other individuals, just trying to focus, if we can, on this particular time. If we were to look to paragraph 9 for a moment under the consideration, what is set out very clearly is that we understand that the Sunday Times are working closely with the BBC's Panorama programme ahead of a programme which could potentially air as soon as mid-August. Now, leaving aside when it was that you eventually had sight of this particular document, there is, if one accepts the accuracy of that observation in paragraph 9, perhaps an element of pressure on you to reach a decision as to whether you make an announcement before the Panorama programme is aired or after.
Well, that may be your view if you weren't me. I mean, as a Secretary of State, I wasn't going to be pressurised by one submission or other.
Again, it's not seeking to suggest that you were being pressurised by one submission or another. It's simply looking at the timing. If a decision needs to be taken in advance of a particular date, that might put a time pressure within which you need to take that particular decision.
As I've said earlier, I'm not pressurised by a media narrative outside of this courtroom or outside my department. I'm concerned with the facts, and I'm concerned with evidence. I'm concerned with making sure we do the right thing by everyone, whether it's victims or whether it is a member of our armed forces. And that was simply the case. So people who work for me in my private office and elsewhere will know that it's probably the least of my consideration whether I look good on the front of a newspaper.
And leaving aside the newspapers for a moment, another concern that was raised is set out in paragraph 10, and it was that the prosecutor at the ICC had indicated in late 2017 that she was aware of the allegations of extrajudicial killings by UK special forces, although she'd been persuaded not to refer to them in her public statements. You were being advised that she intends to conduct a preliminary examination into these, and as we see in the penultimate line, she will be particularly interested in any suggestion that investigations have not been conducted effectively, as this is one of the considerations of the ICC when deciding whether to assert jurisdiction. So, leaving aside any sense of media pressure, which you've set out very clearly you wouldn't bow to, you were being advised that there might possibly be pressure from the ICC in an assessment that they might make as to whether there had been a proper and effective investigation. Was that a concern that you had, Sir Ben, back in the autumn of 2019?
First of all, her concerns are entirely mirror of my concerns. That we want to make sure this has been done properly and that the quality of the investigation would bear up to legal scrutiny. And indeed, I think the only concern I would have had about the ICC is it's a bad reflection on our own judicial system and our own system of government if they have to get involved. I think that is how I would say it. So it would certainly create more pressure in my mind than a media story, because the ICC is a body that we have signed up to and we take seriously, and we take seriously the international rule of law that we are obliged to do so. So I think, but can I just correct you though? When you say you're not bow to media pressure, my point is simply it's not a consideration to me doing my job. Right? It's not a sort of a face-off that I'm going to bow to it as a confrontational relationship. I care about my reputation, obviously, and truth and honesty about whether I stand, but fundamentally I'm not going, that's not the same as not bowing to it. It's not a factor that would I would take into consideration when dealing with such important issues.
Thank you.
I would, however, listen to I would read the reports and see if there are any points, and I used some of the reports to challenge the department. And that was my point about no matter what I think of different elements of the media, I was always open to all people's reporting to raise to attention things that may have not happened or been overlooked or not come to my attention through official channels.
Can we just have your help, please, as to the presentation section that is set out at paragraphs 12 and 13? And this, of course, we remind ourselves is a note from the Deputy Head of DGEP. What was set out was, given the imminent media interest from BBC Panorama, it's recommended that the announcement of the closure of Operation Northmoor is made as soon as possible. This will allow Ministry of Defence to release the announcement on our own terms, but also give us an opportunity to emphasise the independent oversight of the investigations. Were you comfortable with that recommendation, Sir Ben, when you read it in September of 2019?
Well, I didn't act on it. So if we go back to its recommendation, I didn't act on the recommendation of this submission, which demonstrates that I disagreed with large parts of the submission. And some of this obviously already reflects the earlier paragraphs in the submission about, we could get out ahead of it or whatever it was, it says in it. But ultimately, I didn't agree that there was any advantage to doing it. So therefore, the final paragraph doesn't sort of wash in that sense. If I don't agree with it, then paragraph 13 doesn't really have a material effect.
Could we just look nonetheless at paragraph 13, because this is what was provided to you by the Deputy Head of the Directorate of Judicial Engagement. We in DDC recommend that the closure of Operation Northmoor should be briefed to a friendly journalist in order to try and get the story out on our own terms.
Is there such a thing? Is there such a friendly journalist?
I think you would probably know the answer to that better than me, Ben. And again, no offence to the officials, but media handling is not usually the strengths of officials who work in other policy areas. But fundamentally, there are media officials, etc., but fundamentally, what was at the heart of this is, was I prepared to publicly announce the closure of an investigation when I didn't really accept the premise in the first place that you close investigations? And secondly, I didn't read that somehow getting ahead of a Times, Sunday Times or a Panorama thing would have been advantageous anymore, that would have been disadvantageous. Can I take you back to the very first page and then to the handwritten note that is written to the top? You told us at the outset that that is not in your handwriting. It appears to read, I would have preferred to wait, but on balance, underlined, in light of Panorama, we should announce end of investigations.
Well, I didn't announce the end of investigations, so I don't know who, I mean, it isn't my writing, but I didn't.
And as far as this is a note of anyone's observation, it's not a note then of any observation that you made during the course of discussing this document with anyone? No,
not that I had. I mean, I went on from here to investigate further the Northmoor. So, yeah, I don't know that it's not my writing, and I don't know where my box note should have been there.
And just finishing off the handwriting, in case it helps jog your memory as to whether you've seen it at all before other than in the preparation of this witness statement. This will, however, prompt some detailed questions about the investigations which RMP will have to answer. Also, with hands-off approach by ministers, how are we assured investigation is thorough? And that last is a question. Insofar as assurance that the investigation is thorough,
yeah,
is that something that you were seeking to
yes,
get an assurance?
And I think probably from the investigation of that, it's why it led to no announcement.
So insofar as a reference to with a hands-off approach by ministers, how are we assured investigation is thorough, is that an observation that you might have made, Sir Ben? Or is
I don't know when this writing was inserted. I don't know whose it belongs to. My box note has not been produced. You will get in front of every submission a blank bit of paper, sir, that you write your comments in, and etc. But I could, what I would certainly say is that, the result of this submission is it didn't follow its recommendation. So I'm not sure whose that is, but it doesn't match the actions, which was it didn't follow the recommendation.
In the immediate aftermath of reviewing this document and declining to follow the recommendations, can you help us now with the steps that you took to get a better understanding of Operation Northmoor and the apparent decision to close that investigation?
Well, as I said, from paragraph 6 is where I was first given effectively the clues to where I should go and seek some assurance, or at the very least interrogate those people that had been involved in that. And that included Sir John Murphy, the former Chief Constable of Merseyside. And I thought that was very, very important to do so and start progressing those challenges and questions, I think. So that's where I took from this submission, is that who I should then follow up with and meet, and that's where I got it from.
In addition to speaking to him, his name having been set out in paragraph 6 as you've observed, did you want to speak to anyone who might be involved in the investigation itself?
No, I was very cautious about that. I mean, I've said earlier that for me as a minister to go into a police force, whether it's military or civilian, and interrogate their investigation when there is a service prosecuting authority above it, I would think would, lead to all sorts of suggestions that I interfered with the police investigation. So leave it to the professional. The professional was Sir John Murphy, former Merseyside Chief Constable, and leave it to him. And I read his report, and then I had a meeting with him, and I had also read Justice Lyon's report as well. I mean, it is for the professionals. It's not for me to ascertain how a police investigation should be going or not.
And it may be obvious from your last remark what the answer to this question is, but may I still ask it, which is this. At any stage now, having reviewed this document, did you seek to speak to anyone within UKSF about the allegations that have been made to get some sort of assurance from them as to the accuracy of what was being alleged?
I did two things. So I read, as documents were being released to the judicial review, I would read extensively many of those documents in folder after folder. And Ben Sanders was, I think in 2020, was designated to go through huge amounts of documentation. And that's when, after I think in the July of the following year, we gave up to the judicial review more papers that had come to light. So throughout the process, I read extensively the papers, including the most minor detail, including effectively emails between members of SF in other locations, even where people and the inquiry would have seen some of those documentations, to get a feel of what was being said in the background, as well as trying to understand what was, who was making these original allegations or claims, because I think that was quite important. And I can't refer to them in an open session, but there are examples of those documentations that have been submitted to this inquiry where you can see it. And so not only did I deal with that, also, I need to get you just the name of the individual. When I was informed that N1785 had potentially raised concerns, I spoke to him as well.
Other than speaking to N1785 and reading the documents that you've told us about, did you have discussions with anyone else within UKSF about these allegations?
I deliberately, I'm not an investigator, but I deliberately didn't want to be, poking around in any part of the armed forces without the appropriate investigators doing it. In other words, without me. I mean, I wanted, as a former soldier, to understand what I'd been reading, but it was also very important to separate chatter that I read as opposed to people that were there at the time. And, you know, the military is full of gossip. It's, you know, it's always it's like any community, including the barristers' community. There's always who's up and who's down, what's going on. There is chatter. So it's always important to keep your ears open. But it was also very important to me to make sure that if I felt there was something untoward, that we made sure that that was properly assured and looked at. And you know, ultimately, it goes back to Chief Constable Murphy and others about whether they satisfied themselves about how far the net was cast, who did they speak to, and indeed the military police about whether or not they followed up on documents that may have come to light subsequent to this submission, originally this 16th of July submission by the Provost Marshal, which led to this submission of the 5th of August. Were they aware of any other documents after the fact that was written? And that's not a question I can answer, that's a question that they no doubt can answer to the inquiry.
Trying to keep matters again in chronological order if we can I invite you to go back to your statement for a moment, please, Sir Ben? And can I take you to your page 5?
Yep.
And you'll see that having dealt with the submission that I've just asked you questions about, you set out in your paragraph 17, given the complex, lengthy and serious nature of the Operation Northmoor investigations, I wish to gain a greater understanding of Operation Northmoor before making assertions about it, especially having only just been appointed to Secretary of State and given my previous experience in government. You then go on to identify observations made by Johnny Mercer in his witness statement about what happens with him when he joined the MOD in July of 2019. Can I, and I'll pause,
Get his statement.
I'll pause you to get your bearings, please.
Mr. Glasgow, in accordance with the usual procedure, I've made a restriction order. This order restricts the publication, dissemination, disclosure, or repetition of anything that was said or done on today, the first day of this hearing, 23rd of September 2024, of the hearing of this evidence during the 10-minute period from 11:05 until the hearing was adjourned, which was approximately 20 past, but the precise timing will be identified, pending publication of the official transcript on the inquiry's website. This order remains in place indefinitely until varied or revoked.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the interruption. We've had our mid-morning break, so we'll now run till lunch.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir Ben, you had been helpfully assisting the inquiry with your discussions with Johnny Mercer and the concerns that he had brought to your attention, and you'd identified a difference in his recollection and yours as to the extent of the information he provided to you. And can I make sure that I have understood properly the distinction between your two recollections? As far as you recall, he, Mr. Mercer, expressed concerns to you about rumours surrounding the UKSF's activities in Afghanistan, but you do not recall him saying anything to you to the effect that he had spoken to an individual who had given him specific information about an allegation that he, that person, had been asked to carry a dropped weapon. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And can I make sure that I've understood the significance that you draw between the rumours on the one hand that you accept Mr. Mercer told you of, and the account from an individual that he, Mr. Mercer, had spoken to that you do not recall ever being told? What, to your mind, is the difference, if it isn't blindingly obvious, between the rumours that were reported to you and the specific information that Mr. Mercer recorded in his statement and said when he gave evidence?
Well, I think, like the paragraph in his statement, but also in the documents that have been submitted to this inquiry from the wider community, you will notice that people made or discussed amongst themselves on email issues around this Afghanistan allegations, even though they were not there or not present. And they were discussing it because they belonged to a community that could discuss or did discuss these things, and I know those emails have been submitted to the inquiry. And that is a difference between someone who could, in my mind, act as a witness, who is actually able to be a lead to follow up, to say, you were actually asked, if Mr. Mercer's submission was correct, you were actually asked by someone who was no doubt perpetrating the alleged crime to do this action. And if that was the case, then that's to me a very different space from people, hearsay, second, third hand discussions by a community or indeed the wider parts of the armed forces.
And does that echo back to what you'd said earlier this morning when you'd said that it was important that the investigation proceed on evidence rather than rumour?
Yes, I think very important that is what we have to proceed in anything we do, not just in this issue. We have to ultimately proceed on that. And one of the lessons I learned from working from Ken Clark was that the only people who really know what goes on in a court are the ones who are there from the beginning to the end. So not people who turn up for the last day or the middle of the day or the star witness.
Can I ask you this, please? If Mr. Mercer had told you that he had first-hand information from someone who reported to Mr. Mercer that that individual had been asked to carry a dropped weapon whilst in Afghanistan, what advice would you have given to Mr. Mercer as to what he should do with that information?
the same advice I gave to anyone, including the BBC, when they would write the letters to me, that if you had any evidence, you please share it with the police, the military police, for their investigation. I mean, there's no point sharing it with me. Share it with the correct authorities whose job it is to investigate the allegations.
Insofar as any reference to dropped weapons other than from Mr. Mercer, were you aware of allegations that dropped weapons were said to be carried on operations in Afghanistan by UKSF?
Well, I was aware from the reporting in the media throughout this process, not, I think, before that initial 5th of August submission we've referenced this morning, but I was definitely aware that part of the narrative and the reporting in the media was that this was a method that was carried out in the prosecution of the unlawful killings. And so I was definitely alert to it. And I was also alert to the fact that some of those emails that were subsequently submitted, both in the judicial review and I suspect, I'm guessing in this inquiry, referred to, I'm not sure they used the phrase drop weapon, but certainly referred to the likes of this doesn't seem right, or this is, one too many occasions of X or Y happening. So I think I would put it into that context.
Insofar as you thought Mr. Mercer was the right person to get to the bottom of the allegations that he had been made privy to in the form of rumour, did you offer him any assistance other than simply that you were directing him to do that act?
Well, two things. His authority comes with his position. I mean, that was his portfolio underneath him, people, veterans, etc. So he had authority within that very position he held as the minister. And secondly, he has the authority of me, and therefore my authority gives him the whole resource of the department within the law, should he wish to do so. And of course, like me, he knew to respect the separation between a minister and the police and the independent investigatory authorities, the independent service prosecuting authority, but ultimately that's what it means.
And were you expecting that he would provide you with an update or an answer to that direction you had given him?
Well, he did throughout, and I don't take issue with much of his evidence throughout this process. He did throughout raise concerns when he had felt that either he wasn't getting the right answers, or indeed, if the media highlighted concerns, he raised his concerns throughout, including on that meeting, I think the following August, after, I think, the Sunday Times report. So he always would raise concerns. I wasn't any different from that. I think as I'd started to go, start looking into that original submission, that's why we're sitting here today. I established this inquiry in order so we can get to the bottom of this. I mean, hardly the narrative of cover-up for this Secretary of State to set up this inquiry. This is trying to get to the bottom of it, using the correct processes and privileges that is awarded quite rightly to the judiciary, the judicial process. So he did raise it, he often raised it, and I took all my minister's concerns seriously. I did not discount out of hand or discard out of hand any of their concerns. And so, yeah, I mean, we followed up many things, and you'll see later when it comes to the motion video, I think Mr. Mercer's recollection is disproved by my actions on the motion video, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do, and we will come to that in detail later on, but since you've touched upon it, Sir Ben, can I simply ask you this at this stage? Mr. Mercer described in his evidence to the inquiry that he thought that you lacked curiosity when it came to responding to some of the allegations that he brought to your attention. Is that a description of your attitude towards what he said to you as an inaccurate one?
I think it's highly inaccurate. I think my actions, if you look at my statement, are the entire opposite of that. I didn't take the first submission at face value, and I never took the last one at face value. Not only did I seek to dig deeper, I also even seek to dig internationally to try and get to the bottom of whether or not assurances I'd be given were truthful. Secondly, I established this inquiry, as I've said. So, no, I was absolutely inquisitive. I held the department to account if I felt that they were not producing what we had asked for, but I also had to reiterate that we had to act on the evidence before us, and that I also have a duty to the men and women of the armed forces to make sure that their reputation is not, dragged through the mud or indeed libelled or besmirched without evidence. I think that is very, very important. As I said, 457 people sacrificed their lives for the UK's deployment to Afghanistan. Some of those people did so in the most dangerous environments possible to make sure we were safe and the people of Afghanistan were safe. And I owe them also a duty to make sure we do not progress recklessly or indeed in the world of perception, but we progress in the manner of fact and evidence.
And in terms of the progress that might be made by the MOD, another observation offered by Mr. Mercer in his evidence was that the MOD was terrible at investigating itself. Is that a description that you agree with or not, Sir Ben?
Well, I don't quite know what he exactly means by that. If he's making a comment on the police investigation by the military police, then I think I would have referred him to Sir John Murphy and the external people that looked at the investigation. Neither he nor I are actually qualified to make that judgment on a police investigation. If it is a comment on the department is not always quick to produce legacy documents that it wishes or is needed by a court or indeed by ministers, then I would say that is correct, that it is not a quick task. Could it be quicker? Undoubtedly it could, but I would agree with that. I'm not sure that goes as far as investigating ourselves. But also, the job of a minister, a good minister, is, I'm afraid, inquisitive, probably a sceptic, fairly distrustful of officialdom, despite the fact our officials do their very best, and if need be, belligerent to get to the bottom of something. And I think that is up to each minister how far they take that, and how far they wish to take it, and how many hours a day and they burn the candle to do their job. I learnt a long time ago that, you win some of these debates or discussions in the detail. So you need to get onto the detail, and if the detail isn't available, you get it. But I can't speak for Johnny Mercer. He would have to tell you to what extent he looked into these things in detail.
If the detail is important, and if you expected Johnny Mercer to apprise himself of the detail, did you ask for him to report back to you on a regular basis to update you, or were you expecting him simply to return as and when?
Well, as and when is probably the best way to do these things, and as you've seen from the bundle, there is plenty of times when he either commented on submissions. One thing that I noticed about the Ministry of Defence when I arrived that was different from Security Minister is rather boringly a bureaucratic process that departments have. Good departments and good Secretary of State, every submission is classified between what you call a 1-2, a 2-1, a 1-2-3. Sounds dull. 1-2 means it goes to the junior minister first, the 2, and then it goes to the Secretary of State first. So the Secretary of State gets to read what his or her junior minister thinks. A 1-2-3, it goes to the permanent secretary and others. Now, some departments don't really like that, because they would rather make sure that if a minister didn't agree or it was a bit controversial, that they'll just go straight to the Secretary of State and avoid it. I instigated the Ministry of Defence that every submission that came to me had to be a 1-2 at minimum, even if that meant a delay. You'll notice on the 5th of August one, an important document relating to an important investigation is not a 1-2. Now, if you were to look at my submissions from Security Minister, most of the Home Office submissions I ever met, or were dealt with, were of that level. So it sounds like a boring process, but after this, and a few weeks or months in, I instigated that every submission was at least a 1-2, That does add delay because some ministers don't do their red boxes very quickly, or they want to dig into it much more. And one of my ministers, he would never allow it to go to me until he had done a significant amount of scrutiny, and that could take weeks. And some ministers, it would turn up pretty quickly, but it is entirely the right process, and it's the process how I run this department. So Johnny Mercer would have had lots of opportunities, and did, to raise these issues, and that's the best way I thought to deal with it. And there's a lesson in civil service 1, 2, 3 submissions, but probably not the most exciting.
Can we turn on with the chronology, please, for a moment, Sven? Can I invite you back to your exhibits to look, please, to your 4th exhibit behind our tab 4, which is an email sent out on the 11th of October of 2019. So a few weeks or possibly even a month after the first document that we had looked at. We can see it's sent to a number of individuals, including you, as well as Johnny Mercer's private office, because we can see those addresses in the to list. Do we see that, sir?
Yes, I do.
And it reads as follows. All, we've finally been formally approached by BBC's Panorama on their documentary looking into how effectively the government has dealt with allegations of war crimes from Iraq and Afghanistan. See attached. The letter outlines several allegations and the subsequent handling. As stated in the letter, the programme is likely to make serious allegations on a pattern of cover-ups that may have prevented British soldiers from facing justice. And then it goes on to give a rundown of what is to happen in the next few days. As to the attached letter, which was provided to your private office and also to Mr. Mercer's, you'll find that over on our page 12, which is a letter from the BBC dated the 4th of October of 2019. You'll find that you dealt with this, if it will assist you. I think you'll find that in your paragraph 20 onwards on page 7, Sir Ben.
Yes.
Can we just look together at the letter from the BBC that was sent to you a few days after it had been received?
Yeah.
So for those who are following in the printed bundle, page 12 behind tab 4, but your exhibit 4, Sir Ben. If we look to the second paragraph, we are examining the closure of 2 major investigations into alleged war crimes announced in 2017, Operation Northmoor and the Iraq Historic Allegations Team. Our programme will include details about specific cases that were part of these investigations. The programme is likely to make serious allegations regarding a pattern of cover-ups over the last 2 decades that may have prevented British soldiers from being held accountable for war crimes and left innocent victims and their relatives with no recourse to justice. We want to give you a full opportunity to respond to the points that we're considering for inclusion, so we've outlined them in detail below. Can I just invite you, if you wouldn't mind, sir, to turn on to the next page and to paragraph 4. Because you'd expressed to us the importance of a thorough investigation and the need to get to the bottom of the allegations and to look at all of the relevant evidence. What was set out by the BBC in October of 2019 was as follows. Detectives working on Operation Northmoor believed the deadlines set by the MOD to finish their inquiries made it impossible for them to complete a thorough investigation. And then to the next paragraph, investigators who worked for IHAT and Operation Northmoor believed there was credible evidence of war crimes committed by British troops. They also say that some of this evidence has been covered up by senior officers. Did you read those 2 paragraphs when this document had been provided to your private office in October of 2019, or can you now not remember?
No, I read this letter.
On reading those 2 paragraphs, which appear to make serious allegations about the quality of the investigation that was conducted and the conclusions it reached, what did you do, Sir Ben?
Well, you'll see from my statement that I sought that at a subsequent meeting I had, that we would follow up, we would examine the claims, as in we would first of all write to Panorama and saying, I think this is paragraph 20, if I'm not mistaken, is that right? An initial scan of the allegations within it suggested there was no new evidence being presented. SOS asked that a detailed analysis of the letter be carried out by officials and a copy be passed to the independent investigators to check for anything that might materially impact their investigations. So in that very phrase are 2 things. One is, as I've said earlier, I was open to any suggestions, even if it came from, wherever it came from, media, public, colleagues, etc. As you can see, I asked officials to investigate further or to look at them. And then secondly, to write to the BBC saying, if you are making claims of any evidence or new evidence, you should pass it to the relevant authorities. And I think that is a narrative that I have taken throughout, and that is an example of that from the October letter from the BBC. I'm not aware if the BBC then subsequently did present any new evidence to the military police. I'm sure they may be able to answer that question, but I'm not aware if they did or didn't.
And again, just continuing, please, with the content of the letter from the BBC, could I invite your attention to what is paragraph 39 within that letter, our page 16, Sir Ben. Operation Northmoor was investigating 52 killings in Afghanistan, the majority relating to Special Forces operations. The allegations included executions by UKSF on night raids, covered up through the falsification of mission reports and the use of so-called drop weapons. Despite having gathered significant evidence of potential illegal killings and cover-ups implicating senior soldiers, Operation Northmoor was closed down prematurely. Given the concern that you had identified at being presented with an invitation to announce the closure of Operation Northmoor just after you had come into office, when you read this only a few weeks later, did that chime with the concern you'd had in the back of your mind, which had caused you not to write to the Defence Committee?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said this morning, I didn't act on that recommendation. And throughout, I always said any evidence should be referred to the police because they are charged, the military police, to investigate it. And I think. Look, I don't underestimate or undervalue the seriousness of the allegations. They are very serious allegations, but I also had to bear in mind that Chief Constable Murphy had done an assurance of the investigation. Independently, and at the time he had said to me that he had been happy with the work or the assurances that he had done, and he was a civilian assuring the military police's investigation, and a man of considerable experience both as a detective and indeed as a leader of a force. So I think what I would say is, look, that's why we're sitting here. The concern never went away about whether we were getting to the bottom of it. And part of that concern is because people would continue to raise questions without closure. And I think that's very, very important that we try and get that closure. And that's why I established this inquiry.
Can we look to some of the documents in the immediate aftermath of the receipt of the email and the letter that is attached, please? And trying to deal with it again in a chronological order as best as we can I invite you to turn back to divider number 2, what is numbered our page 7, but it'll be the exhibit number 2 for Mr. Wallace. So, sir, you'll find it on red numbered 7, an email later that same day, the 11th of October 2019. providing a readout, but only the key points and actions. And in particular, can we look to paragraph number 4 with the bold entry at the start, Operation Northmoor? It would seem that Johnny Mercer, as described there, mentioned his preparatory meetings with officials in advance of the upcoming trilat, his office to provide relevant points to the Secretary of State's office. Mr. Mercer queried whether the service police could be contacted in advance of Panorama coverage. And what's recorded is there that you agreed and suggested the department ask for evidence. And does that relate back to what you had said some 3 minutes ago when you set out what you did upon reading the letter
Yes.
from the BBC?
That was asked from evidence from the BBC as opposed to from the service police.
And in terms of whether or not Mr. Mercer should contact the service police in advance of the Panorama coverage, did you agree that that would be an appropriate course of action for him to take, or can you now not remember?
Hang on. Hang on, say that again, please.
If we look to the penultimate sentence, it begins on the second line halfway across. Min DPV, that's Mr. Mercer, queried whether the service police could be contacted in advance of Panorama coverage. Did you think it would be appropriate for the service police to?
Well, I can't deduce from this email for what purposes. I mean, was it contacted for? I mean, I don't know what. I mean, and if you look at this email, I don't even think it was copied even to my private office, does it? David Morgan was my private secretary, but it wasn't copied to me. But fundamentally, these were pre-bilateral notes in advance of the meeting, or notes after it. Readout, sorry, it's after the meeting. SFS was broadly content with Mindy's draft priority, but I'm not sure what exactly he asked for when it meant contacting the service police. It may have been just to alert them that this programme was coming and that they should seek to ask BBC for evidence if they present it in the report.
And insofar as...
But that's speculating, so I don't...
Insofar as you suggested, which is the last sentence of paragraph 4, that the department asked for evidence, that's a request to be made of the BBC for the evidence to support the allegations that they had made.
Well, if they have any new evidence, to submit it to the military police has been my line all the way through, because what we're trying to find here is evidence all the way through. And no doubt this inquiry will be seeking, if there is any evidence out there, to establish that.
When you say new evidence, how was anyone to decide whether the evidence the BBC had was new or not?
Well, that's why contacting the military police would be the most appropriate people. They will be the ones who will be sitting on the whole database or remit of what evidence they had examined. And I wouldn't know, but they would know what they saw reported and what they had in their office, whether there was a gap. Because I wouldn't have ever seen the military police's detailed investigative notes.
But what's recorded here, Sir Ben, and I appreciate it's somebody else's note of only the key points, it's that the department asked for evidence. It's not that the Royal Military Police contact the BBC to ask for it. What role?
Well, because the letter was addressed to me, so I replied to the BBC saying, if you have any new evidence, I think it is an exhibit here.
It is, and we will come to it.
Please, could you refer it to the military or the appropriate authorities? So that's exactly what we're doing.
Can we just look at notes of a further meeting that you had with Mr. Mercer? You'll find that behind our divider number 3, your third exhibit, and Sir Ben, it's page 9 if that helps. It's an email from Damien Parmenter recording the detail of a meeting that you and others had to discuss Operation Northmoor. So do you see that it begins S of S, Secretary of State, Minister for Armed Forces, Minister DPV, met with officials to discuss Operation Northmoor. Can you remember now who the officials were that you met with in order to discuss Operation Northmoor?
Well, we're talking 5 years ago, but I would guess from the list of the CCs, they are the officials. I mean, Isabel Letwin was one of the legal advisors in the department. David Morgan was my assistant private secretary. Paul Wyatt was a senior official, national security, and I'm guessing those were the people, and Dominic Wilson was a senior director general. So I'm guessing those are people I saw on a regular basis, and if they're CC'd in, I can guess. But I don't have an actual attendance list in my bundle or anywhere.
And neither do we, Sir Ben, but obviously we'll understand that at this remove it's difficult to be precise as to who was in the room. The note of the meeting, if that's the appropriate way to describe this email, records in the next paragraph, the first issue discussed was the appropriate time to announce that the Northmoor investigations had effectively ended with all lines of investigation exhausted and no evidence found of criminal behaviour. Can I pause for a moment and ask you this, Sir Ben? As at the middle of October, so some weeks after you'd first been invited to announce the closure of Northmoor, were you satisfied, as best you could be, that it was correct to describe all lines of investigation as having been exhausted and no evidence found of criminal behaviour?
Well, no, because I said in the third paragraph, Secretary of State asked for a detailed analysis of the letter be carried out by officials and a copy past the independent investigation to check if anything might materially impact their investigation. If I had felt it had been, I would not have done those further recommendations.
Thank you. The first paragraph, if we just continue where we were, the timing was closely bound up with the forthcoming BBC Panorama programme on Operation Northmoor and the potential to use the closure of the investigations to sensationalise allegations and accuse the MOD of cover-up. And again, recognising what you've said about any concern you might have as to presentation of your decisions in the media, can I simply ask you this? Were you concerned that the announcement of the closure of Operation Northmoor might sensationalise what had happened and might lead to allegations of a cover-up?
Well, I was concerned that announcing prematurely the closing, even though the wording would not have been mine, of an investigation, when we weren't satisfied potentially that there might have been new evidence to appear, would expose us to undue haste, but also it would expose us to ridicule, effectively. That, you know, we take it seriously. I thought it was important, as I said, as the notes show here, to watch, listen, read Sunday Times, Panorama Media, and if there was anything new, both to approach the BBC and ask for that to be submitted to the military police, but also so that we could satisfy ourselves whether there was anything that we hadn't heard of as well. I think it was very, very important, and you'll see there again. I asked for detailed analysis. What it does show, however, going back to both the original submission and this submission, is there were officials keen for this to be brought to a close. And I think often when officials don't always get what they want, it keeps coming back, rotating through your entry. And that's a job of a minister, which is to say, look, I'm sorry, I've been very clear on my direction. I want us to get to the bottom of this. And for now, no, thank you very much. But in the meantime, I'd like you to take seriously whatever you read or hear or watch and follow it up and then analyse it.
Now, did you get a feel for why it was that officials were keen to close Operation Northmoor and why it kept coming back into your entry?
I didn't, like a lot of policy things like that, so I didn't get a genuine, no one ever told you straight that they felt this as why or not, but I think officials, I'm speculating, but had felt this had gone on for many, many years. Their experience of IHAT and the quite a large number of vexatious claims in IHAT that caused a lot of problems and hurt the armed forces. That was the one with Phil Shiner and the likes. And I think they were keen that if the police had said at the time the investigation was closed, all lines of inquiry had finished, that therefore that maybe it should just be closed. Now, the thing that struck me is it makes not material bit of difference to whether justice can be administered if if I wrote to the Defence Select Committee or anything else that the police investigation had been closed, because if someone came along with some new evidence, they would be duty bound to investigate that and not able to. You can't palm off something whether it's closed for not looking at it. And so it was a rather circular request, I felt, from the department that sort of went round in circles, because ultimately what we were trying to do is get to the bottom of it. And but I can't answer for their motives, sir.
Insofar as any official is capable of being identified who might have had a view as to whether or not it was appropriate for the announcement of the closure of Northmoor to be made public, if we look to the second large paragraph in the middle of the page, it records Peter Ryan provided a brief overview of the Northmoor independent investigations carried out by the RMP and overseen by the Director of Service Prosecutions, with independent assurance provided by Sir John Murphy and Mark Ellison providing a further level of assurance. The investigations had found nothing which provided evidence of criminal activity, a position confirmed by the external reviewers. So insofar as Mr. Ryan was summarising where Operation Northmoor had got to, as far as he was aware, it would seem that he was conveying to you and others in the meeting that no evidence had been found to support any allegation of criminal activity.
Yes, I think that he was communicating the here and now, in that moment. But I know from previous experience in many investigations, but also we were seeing what was being unveiled in Australia, that there is always the potential for other evidence or new evidence to come to light. And in a sense, my point about it being a bit circular, I don't think, my point about being immaterial, I mean, whoever is the Secretary of State, making some grand announcement about effectively a criminal investigation, should have no bearing on that investigation insofar as the service prosecuting authorities and the police authorities. And also, the lesson of the Australian allegations showed that things came to light later. So I was very keen to always keep open, and still do to this day, that we will act on evidence before us, but we should always be open to new evidence.
If what is set out in this email and attributed to Peter Ryan is accurate, what's being summarised is that the investigators and the independent assurers, including legal advisors, had found nothing thus far to support criminal act prosecutions. So what would be wrong with announcing that that stage had been reached insofar as Operation Northmoor is concerned?
Because we don't in this country close investigations. We close lines of inquiry, or we run out of lines of investigations, but fundamentally we don't close investigations that way.
What would be wrong with announcing that the lines of inquiry pursued to date had yielded no viable evidence?
Well, if you look at our answers to some of the media, or indeed our statements for the department, you'll see they are like that. They would say, some of the sort of lines put out by the department is, it would say men and women fought with bravery. This has been thoroughly investigated and it has been assured. I used to often refer to Chief Constable Murphy's and Justice Lyon's assurances. We would say words to that effect. But as I've said consistently, right, that ultimately, you would have to ask the officials why they feel it was important to say it. Indeed, I do remember being criticised by some veterans for not saying it, that it made them anxious all the time that it was never said. But I think, to some large extent, this was much more of a presentational issue than it was the reality.
Insofar as you reached a decision as to what to do in response to the letter, we see that it's set out in the next paragraph, and you'd already drawn our attention to it in answering an earlier question of mine a few moments ago. Ministers and officials discussed the recent letter from the BBC. An initial scan of the allegations within it suggested there was no new evidence being presented. Secretary of State asked that a detailed analysis of the letter be carried out by officials and a copy be passed to the independent investigators to check for anything that might materially impact their investigation. So insofar as you wanted something to be done, 2 stages to it. First, a detailed analysis by officials. And who were the officials that would carry out that analysis, please?
Well, it would be officials from DGEP who would have been in possession of many of the documents because they would be handling the judicial reviews that were in the area we were dealing with, but also they would have the relationship to some extent with the service prosecutors and the military police.
And the second stage to the 2 steps that you'd identified was that a copy be passed to the independent investigators. And by that, do you mean the Royal Military Police? Right. So that they, the RMP, would have an opportunity to make sure that what was written out in the letter from the BBC had already been investigated by them.
Yes. I also think this is another example that contradicts Johnny Mercer's assertion that I was not a curious, inquisitive Secretary of State on this issue. It's yet another document you have which shows me going beyond the recommendations or refusing it and investigating it further.
And then lastly, a letter should be sent to the BBC saying we had received the letter and passed it to the independent investigators. The MOD should not respond on any individual points. The Secretary of State instructed, and this is the penultimate entry, that we should not announce the closing down of the investigation until after the Panorama programme aired. Now,
because we don't know what would be aired.
In which case that means that I don't need to ask the question I was about to ask. So thank you very much, Sir Ben. Can we turn on, please, with your help, to divider number 5, which takes us on a few more days to the 24th of October. Your Exhibit 5, our page 20 within the bundle, Sir Ben. And again, if you want to follow where you are in your witness statement, you'll find it. It's your paragraph 21, page 7 of the statement. If we look together, please, to the note that was sent to you from Ben Sanders at DGEP, dated the 24th of October of 2019 and headed Panorama and Northmoor Handling. Issue: how to address the allegations raised in the Panorama letter. That, of course, is the letter that we've just looked at a moment or two ago. Timing pressing. Panorama have set a deadline of tomorrow for MOD to respond. Recommendation that you note: it seems certain that a number of damaging allegations about individual incidents which are broadly accurate will feature in the broadcast. Nevertheless, we will be able to reject robustly the allegation pattern of cover-ups, emphasising that the service police and service prosecuting authority are independent. And then to entry 4, in all other respects, your directed approach of not engaging with the allegations before the programme airs remains viable. Can I ask you please to go back then to the first bullet point that you were invited to note under recommendation? It seems certain that a number of damaging allegations about individual incidents which are broadly accurate will feature in the broadcast. If the assessment is now being put upon the allegations that at least some of them are broadly accurate, how did that square in your mind, Sir Ben, with the assurance you've been given by Peter Ryan 8 days before that Operation Northmoor had unearthed no evidence on which to prosecute anyone?
Well, I refer you to paragraph 7 further down, which says many of the allegations, including of attempting to frustrate one, bracket says non-Northmoor, close brackets, RMP. So when you slightly expand broadly accurate, it seems, according to the submission, that wasn't related to Northmoor. It isn't specific in the submission about what allegations. Maybe it is, but it's not from my memory.
With respect to Ben, could I invite you to look at paragraph 7 again together with me, because it may be that it's easy to misread, or it may, of course, be my fault. Many of the allegations, if one leaves out the intervening part, many of the allegations are broadly accurate, and of the allegations, including of attempting to frustrate one non-Northmoor RMP investigation. That doesn't mean that many of the allegations are all non-Northmoor. Does it not mean that there are many allegations which are broadly accurate, including one which is outside of the remit of Northmoor?
It could be that, yes.
The level of detail suggests that they have spoken to well-placed sources, certainly former IHAT investigators and potentially the whistleblower discredited by the Northmoor investigations, who pressed for an investigation into deaths during deliberate detentions and operations. There is a risk that these sources will have provided Panorama with documents that will enable them to substantiate these allegations. So again, Sir Ben, this is some 8 days or so after Peter Ryan has given you the assurance that the investigation conducted by Northmoor and overseen by independent assessors has produced no credible evidence upon which to found a prosecution. And now you're being advised by DGEP and by Ben Sanders that many of the allegations Panorama is about to air are broadly accurate, and there is actually a risk that Panorama will have access to documents that will enable them to substantiate the allegations they are making. How did that square, please, Sir Ben, with what had previously been said only a few days before, which was the effect, this has all been looked at and there's no evidence?
Well, I think, first of all, I would take, if you look at the recommendations 1 to 4, it does also, however, says that nevertheless in 3.2 we will be able to reject robustly the alleged pattern of cover-ups. So I think what is maybe missing from this submission is which allegations specifically and individual incidents are they referring to, and does it reach a level of evidence that should be of concern. And then if we add that to the fact I asked that we then write to the BBC to make those allegations available to the military police, not to DGEP, but to the military, the police authorities, my expectation would be that if paragraph 3.1 were therefore materially impacting on the investigations of murder or unlawful killing, then that evidence would be addressed, interrogated, and indeed used by the military police.
Can we look together at paragraph 8 for a moment? These allegations of what we know from the Iraq and Afghan litigation about patterns of conduct make it impossible to characterise all of the allegations arising from those operations as vexatious and spurious.
That's correct.
And again, when you saw that DGEP were categorising it as impossible to dismiss the allegations as vexatious and spurious, did you pause to think there might be more to this than I was told previously?
Well, I didn't need to pause to think because I'd always thought that. Hence the reason I'd rejected the earlier advice first issued to me. I always felt that there was, as I said, not only at the beginning of this morning, but also the example of the Australian model, that there was always a potential and that you can never say never. I also was aware that, yes, there had been previous cases litigated against, or indeed, I think, inquiries, you have to correct that if I'm wrong, that had showed in Iraq abuses or law breaking. So I think it would be always wrong to say that every single thing was vexatious and spurious, but I also know there are examples of vexatious and spurious claims, such as the Phil Shiner episode from public interest lawyers, if you remember, from Iraq, which I think dealt with nearly 2,000 claims, if I'm not mistaken, or allegations, which I think ultimately ended up in Mr. Shiner being charged with fraud. So there were some vexatious claims, but there were also some claims that turned out clearly to be correct. And not just in these areas. I mean, some of them go back very, very, very long time ago.
Well, leaving aside Iraq and even earlier allegations, the note of caution being sounded out by Ben Sanders in this note to you and others is that you can't dismiss the allegations being made by Panorama as vexatious and spurious. So we're not, with respect, Sir Ben, in the Phil Shiner territory here. The advice you're being given is, it would appear, that the allegations, many of them are broadly accurate. Did alarm bells ring in your mind when you were advised by DGEP that the allegations being made by Panorama were broadly accurate, when only a few days before Peter Ryan had told you that the investigation had unearthed no evidence?
I think what I would say is some of the allegations were spurious. If I turn to paragraph 14, the end paragraph, where the line says, "We reject your unsubstantial allegations of pattern comments. Your allegations relating to General Sir Mark Carlton-Smith are untrue." So what, I'm not sure if we have the letter, I think we do have the letter in full. You'll see that some of the allegations around sort of conspiracy were absolutely, I think, of the view that they were definitely spurious and sort of sensational. David Cameron and Mark Carlton-Smith type station. I mean, have you got those allegations there?
We do. If one looks over the page to paragraph 9,
Yes.
we should continue to resist allegations of widespread systemic abuse and criminal behaviour, and we should rebut Panorama allegations about investigations and prosecution decisions being improperly influenced, and that their individual examples amount to evidence of a pattern of cover-ups. But that's not the point that I'm seeking to explore with you, Sir Ben. What you've been told in the missive from Ben Sanders is that many of the allegations are broadly accurate and that they can't be characterised as vexatious and spurious.
Yes.
Did that make you think for a moment that there might be more to this than nothing, as was said to have been found by Northmoor by Peter Ryan?
Yes, and that's why I said, going way back, even in August of 2019, I believe there was always more to look for, and I continued all the way through to look for the bottom of the fact. I'm not sure if you seem to understand that. All the way through these documents, you will see me saying, indeed, there's an email from a Perm Sec asking us not to have a public inquiry. Well, I didn't listen to that because we're sitting in one. So I think my point is, all the way through, I kept open the possibility that new evidence could be presented and should be investigated, all the way through. But I was also minded, because the letter sent in full from Panorama goes beyond allegations around the actual events and suggests a wider pattern of cover-ups and conspiracy, some of which are spurious and thin, such as the Mark Carlton-Smith, David Cameron meeting, which is quite an important part of their allegations. It wasn't aired, I noticed.
When it came to the description that many of the allegations are broadly accurate, did you ask anyone which were the allegations that were broadly accurate?
I think what we started on at that stage was a process of getting to the bottom of trying to get even more, to getting all of the documents and everything else. I can't remember the actual date that I said, and I'd have to get my details, but I would certainly say that, if you remember, I was still to have my meeting with Chief Constable Murphy, which I think was in October 2019.
It was.
So I was still on the hunt for my own personal assurances, and all of these meetings gave further questions that I continue to follow up.
But before you even needed to meet with Sir John Murphy, was any request made of Ben Sanders or someone else in his department for an explanation as to how it was already being assessed that many of the allegations are broadly accurate?
Well, I think what we needed to do was, as we say, we did the analysis at the time. Well, according to the submission, we got the analysis. And there was further work ongoing because of the judicial reviews. And as you will know, and I don't have the exact date, that during the process of discovery for the judicial reviews, more information came to light that was then submitted to the judicial reviews, I think the following year. Information that I think we probably would have all liked to have seen as ministers earlier stages.
So Ben, you said earlier, in accordance with the document that we'd looked at, that there were two steps you wanted done. First, you wanted a detailed analysis to be done of the BBC's claims, and secondly, the details should also be passed to the RMP so that they were aware of the allegations. You now have a document from the Department for Judicial Engagement where it appears that the detailed examination has been done, because Ben Sanders writes to you that many of the allegations are broadly accurate. So if that is correct, step one in your two-step plan has been carried out. Namely,
no, I didn't take that at face value, because that's what... Well, if I took it at face value, I'd have cancelled my meeting with Chief Constable Murphy and not continued to try and investigate in this process.
Well, before you met with Sir
But
John
I did have the meeting after this. I could have cancelled it. I could have taken DJEP at face value, said, well, that's all fine. But I didn't, did I?
Before you met with Sir John Murphy, did you ask for further clarifications as to how it was that DJEP had assessed many of the allegations as broadly accurate?
Well, I can't tell you, but I can refer back to the inquiry with the details of when we asked Ben Sanders and other officials to restart or start the process of absolutely going through every document we could get our hands on. And Ben Sanders, I think in the following year, spent a huge amount of time, literally taken off all duties to get to the bottom of many, many documents, some of which were then we discovered were then submitted, obviously, under candour to the judicial review. So they were... I mean, if I had taken that at face value, that wouldn't have happened. Wouldn't have had my meeting with Chief Constable Murphy, and I'd have said, well, it's all fine and we can all send a letter to whoever people want to send a letter to. I didn't. My actions show that I didn't take it at face value, but also that was one submission compared to all the other submissions that were busy saying all was fine.
Leaving aside the other submissions that said all was fine, when one has a submission from DJEP which says all is in fact not fine, is that the sort of submission that one needs to pay attention to, Sir Ben?
I did pay attention to it. We are sitting in a public inquiry to get to the bottom of it.
Well, we're sitting in a public inquiry in 2024. I'm asking you, sir, about 2019.
Yes.
And about your response to being told that, in fact, many of the allegations are broadly accurate.
Yes.
Were you worried when you read that?
Well, I've said I've never strayed from my belief that there may be more evidence out there. So I think worry is the wrong way. My point was, I took the view that if there was more evidence out there, BBC, in my letter to the BBC, please, will you pass that to the relevant police authorities and they can investigate. I mean, that I wouldn't have put that in a letter if I thought it was fine. And I was always trying to seek the evidence required.
But, and again, I don't mean to labour the point, Sir Ben, but we're not talking about the possibility of more evidence out there or seeking further evidence. An assessment has been done by DJEP on what they already have in their possession, and they have concluded many of the allegations are broadly accurate. They're not, and I don't mean to be facetious, but they're not guessing here. They have done the detailed analysis of material in their possession, and a conclusion is reached that many of the allegations are broadly accurate. At that stage, did you then think to yourself, it's not a case of asking for more evidence in the future, I need something more to be done about what we've already got?
Well, I think
Mr. Glasgow's point is that Ben Sanders was saying to you, in effect, there was already evidence which suggested that the allegations were, quotes, broadly accurate.
Well, I think, sir, the subsequent action of Ben Sanders and his task to discover even more documents was part of the department and my desire to get to the bottom of this and make sure that we completely complied with candour insofar as the judicial reviews. And again, I would need a timeline to know our relationship between the October 2019 and the in parallel judicial reviews that were going on, because that also had an effect on both the actions of people like my officials and what they were servicing at any one moment in time. And I think, secondly, the actions that what I would like to see, and I don't have, is what detailed analysis they submitted alongside this letter to show they had carried out the analysis. But I think what I would also say is, if you look at the actual public-facing MOD spokesperson's comment we made as a result of this submission, it doesn't rule out or throw anything out other than asking that the BBC refer it to the independent, and indeed they are rightly independent from me as the MOD. We could have, if I'd ignored this, I could have just produced the earlier submissions and said nothing to answer here, it's all closed.
Among the number of people to whom this document was sent by Ben Sanders, if we look together to the third page, which is our page 22, Sir Ben, you'll see that it was copied to Johnny Mercer. He's the third of the individuals identified. It was copied to his private secretary, I should say. Your page 22.
Okay, yeah.
Copies to, third one down,
Yes.
private secretary, Min DPV.
Yeah.
Do you recall now whether you discussed with Johnny Mercer the fact that he had spoken to you about rumours, but it now seems that DJEP had assessed the allegations as being broadly accurate?
I can't recall discussing this particular submission with Johnny Mercer, and I would need to know if he actually was. He probably was in attendance at the meeting. He could well have been at the time, but I'm not aware if he was. But my discussion with Johnny Mercer was always ongoing.
You've told us on a number of occasions that you had a meeting in October. And can I please take you in your witness statement first of all? Bottom of page 7, paragraph 22. A meeting on the 28th of October attended by a number of persons, including Damien Parmenter.
Mm-hmm.
You believe that it appears likely that it was at or around the time of this meeting on the 28th of October that you were shown a letter that had been written by N1785 and sent to N1802. If I allow you to get your bearings, you'll find it in the red file, Spen. You'll find that those ciphers are set out behind divider number 1.
Yeah, got it.
And if you recall the letter, because it was dealt with when I opened the allegations to the inquiry many months ago, it was to the effect that a report was made by N1785 to N1802 that confessions to the murder of Afghan civilians during the course of DDOs taking place have been carried out by UKSF. And in very broad terms, do you recollect the nature of the letter that you were shown either at or around this meeting on the 28th of October?
I would say my memory is of the gist of it rather than the wording of it.
I was not expecting word-for-word recall some 4 or 5 years on.
But yes, I do remember it. But it wasn't naturally raised with me, or it wasn't raised with me. I had to find out that it existed and then ask to see it.
Now, can I please ask you a little bit about that? Do I understand from what you've just told us, Sir Ben, that you became aware that there was a letter that you would want to have a look at, and that you then had to make inquiries to be provided with a copy of that letter?
Yes, it took time for my request and the letter to appear. And it was important for me because it was around the appointment of N7185 to another position.
It's 1785.
Yeah, to another position.
Thank you.
I wanted to satisfy myself what was about before I did so.
Can you remember now who it was that, and I'm not asking for the name at this stage, but can you remember now who it was that brought to your attention the fact that there was a letter in existence which you would need to have sight of at some point?
No, I can't.
In terms of the letter itself, was it easy for you to get access to the letter?
Well, it was clearly classified, and I got it. I mean, I can't tell you the timescale between asking and getting, and I would need to check what the timescale was for the appointment of N1785 to another post, and that may give me a clue of when exactly I examined it. But it was, I think it was one of those issues that you spot somewhere buried in the back of documents or submissions, and you ask, it's like a footnote or something, and you ask to see it, rather than it being, you should be aware of this.
So although you can't remember with any great clarity, and that's not a criticism, your recollection is that there was a reference to the existence of this document in something that was provided to you either in a footnote or somewhere else, and that you identified the potential significance of that reference and then made the request to view the document and in due course were provided with it.
Yes.
Having subsequently read the letter, would you have expected it to be not just buried in a footnote, but given much greater prominence?
I would have expected N1802 to act in accordance with the Armed Forces Act on receipt of that, which the law requires that person to make a complaint to the military police or make that allegation known. That is what I would have expected. That's what the law requires them to do so. But if we remember, the letter was dated in 2011, so a lot of water had both gone under the bridge, but also by that stage, these things were being looked at in the judicial reviews, where the government conceded under ECHR, I think for Northmoor, had conceded, or one of the, I think it's Northmoor, had conceded the lack of timeliness in the response to investigate. So I would have done, that's what I would have expected, but that was nearly 10 years previously, but ultimately, yes, that's what the law says.
And as regards the submission that you received, in which you saw this referred to buried, would you have expected it, given the nature of the document itself, to have been given greater prominence in the submission rather than just buried in a footnote?
I think it's a very important document, and what actions followed subsequent to it is incredibly important to this inquiry and anything else. Why didn't certain people follow the Armed Forces Act and act in the way that they are expected to do so? I think by that stage we were pretty well into some of the two judicial reviews already, and I think if I were to describe what was going on, is the same officials that come and see me about what Panorama was doing were the very same officials dealing with the judicial reviews in the courts at the same time, and I think for some of them they too were discovering documents that they hadn't seen previously as well. And I think that's why, at a moment, I tasked Ben Sanders to do this completely comprehensive. I think it took him weeks or months to go through documents that should have already been both served up to the court, but should already have been properly indexed and filed and available. I need to get those dates, but I remember having a meeting in the 2020 on them.
On reading the letter, was it immediately obvious to you that it was potentially significant?
Yes, I mean, the thing to remember, I'm just trying to get the right cipher here. N1785 was a highly respected, capable officer with high integrity. And so a letter from that individual will always raise concerns, or should have always raised concerns. You know, I think those are questions for other people about what happened subsequently, but, you know, I learnt about it roughly a decade on off that letter. But yes, it did. And I had a meeting with him before the appointment to the new post to ask if he was satisfied with where we were now on that issue. Because by then we were in the judicial review phases, I think, and he knew that we were trying to get to the bottom of it.
Can I just check that I've understood? You said you had a meeting with N1785
Yes.
to ask him whether he was satisfied
That his concerns raised in the original letter a decade ago was now being taken seriously and being dealt with. Now, obviously he didn't have the privilege to all the widest actions of the department and the police investigators, but it was very important to me to establish that.
Aside from the two of you, was anyone else present at that meeting?
I can't recall.
And do you know if any notes were taken of that meeting?
I can't recall. I can try and look to get some diary dates for that.
Given the potential significance of the meeting and what was discussed, do you think it likely that notes would have been taken of such a meeting?
They should have been.
Or could
I will. I'm sure the Ministry of Defence is sitting in the room. We can find in.
I suspect a request from you, Sir Ben, carries a little more force than a question from us.
Okay.
We'd be very grateful if
Yeah.
You could assist. Thank you very much indeed. Can I just try to finish this topic, if I may, before we break for lunch?
Indeed.
Recognising, as you did on reading that letter, that it had potential significance to the allegations that were being made, what steps, if any, did you take to find out whether an investigation had been conducted into the allegations that had been raised in the letter in 2011?
Well, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, those were the Northmoor investigations.
Did you seek to find out whether that letter that you had sight of following your identifying its potential relevance in a footnote, did you want to find out whether the RMP had even had sight of that letter?
Well, I presume as it appeared as a footnote or in a document to me or a reference, that the military police within the last decade would have had sight. I don't know. I didn't establish whether they did or didn't, but if it was genuinely by that stage referenced and I had sight of it when I requested it, I made a presumption that the police investigation in 2012, 2013 will have seen that letter. I mean, and I'd have to refresh my memory, but the letter itself, if memory serves me right, maybe it was highly specific. I can just remember the view or a concern that N1785 had heard from others, a concern about what had been going on in Afghanistan.
And
So,
again,
I mean, I'm happy to refresh my memory if I can have access to that letter.
of course, if that's necessary, we can make that available to you. And I'm happy to have a break now if that's a convenient moment. And if it's thought appropriate for you to have sight of a copy, then you must indeed have a sight of it, Sir Ben. I'm afraid I have to confess, I thought since you'd raised it in your statement to us that you would have had an opportunity to look at it before completing your statement, but that's my mistake.
I think as Johnny Mercer's evidence mentioned, he was given sight of it and then it was taken away. So but the points for me still stood, which was a very respected member of the community had raised concerns. He had raised it up the chain of command, and that individual should, in accordance with the Armed Forces Act, make a complaint to the military police. What I was not privy to was what actually happened in 2011. It was a decade before, so I don't know, I still don't know, and no doubt you will hear from these individuals at the inquiry what they then did.
Well, did you ask anyone what had happened 10 years ago? I've had sight of a potentially significant letter that was written back in 2011. Can anyone tell me what happened? Was this acted on? Was it
Well,
investigated?
I knew there was a police investigation, so I made a presumption that that letter, by that stage, a decade later, had been seen by the military police. And I think, if my memory serves me correctly, and I stand to be corrected, that Chief Inspector Murphy had been aware of that. And when I had my meeting with him, I think it was mentioned then.
Well, perhaps that would be a convenient moment. Thank you very much for your help, Sir Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. We'll adjourn now, please, until 2 o'clock.